Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. We are very pleased to take you to Helena, Montana for our Face the State, and we're going to be visiting for the next half hour with noted author and historian Dr. Stephen Ambrose in Helena. Dr. Ambrose, it's certainly nice to have you with us on the program today. I know that you're in and out of Montana quite frequently, but it's tough to catch you for 30 minutes.
I live here.
Indeed you do. We want to go clear back to your childhood, where you were born, a little bit of how you got interested in writing and that type of thing. And where was home? Where were you born? Your family?
I was born in Decatur, Illinois in January of 1936, and the war came, and my dad, who was a doctor, joined the Navy on December 8, 1941. And then we lived all over the United States as camp followers. And after the war, he settled in Whitewater, Wisconsin. And that's where I went to high school, and that's what you always think of as your hometown, where you went to high school.
Sure. How large a family?
I have an older and a younger brother.
Okay. I'd like to take you back to high school. As you started school, was there one point or a teacher, an instructor that really struck you as, I want to get interested in history? Do you think?
My first publication was in a boys' magazine when I was 12 years old. It was a poem about winter. It wasn't a very good poem. And in high school, I intended to be a doctor, following my father's footsteps and take up his practice, and went to the University of Wisconsin with that in mind, and was a pre-med for a year. And then at the beginning of my sophomore year, the University of Wisconsin, in its wisdom, said, you got to take a history course. I just wanted to do biology and chemistry, and I wanted to get on with getting into medical school. And William B. Hesseltine was the teacher in this course, and he hadn't spoken 10 words. And I had completely shifted my orientation. I wanted to do what he did for a living, and I told him that at the end of that first lecture. And he laughed. He said, stick around, I'll show you how to do it. And I went down from Bascom Hill in Madison to the registrar's office and changed my major from pre-med to history. And I've never looked back.
Looking back at that, what did he do or say, do you think, that instilled that? You say he said so very little.
It was a very good lecture. It was on George Washington. But he said that in this course, you're not going to be doing a term paper in which you read 5 or 6 books and then summarize the contents, which is what we were accustomed to doing. You're going to be doing some original research. You're going to be working on a Wisconsin politician or businessman or professional man who is notable, but not notable enough that anybody ever wrote a real biography about him. And my graduate students are going to take you down to the Historical Society and show you how to do that research, what sources to go to. I had Charles A. Billinghurst as the subject. He was a one-term congressman before the Civil War from Milwaukee. Hesseltine had said to us, in doing this work, we're going to be putting it into the Dictionary of Wisconsin Biography, and you're going to be adding to the sum of the world's knowledge. I was just thunderstruck by that. It had never before occurred to me that I could add to the sum of the world's knowledge. I did the paper, did the course, and when I handed in the about 15 pages of biography, and I'd gone through the papers of Billinghurst, which weren't very much, and then the newspapers out of Milwaukee and his speeches in Congress and so on, I felt so proud. I knew more about Charles A. Billinghurst than anybody else in the world. And then I quickly discovered that was because nobody else had any interest in Charles A. Billinghurst. And then I discovered if I tell the story right, I can get them interested. And that got me started.
Do you remember what your grade was on the paper?
No, I don't.
It doesn't really matter. It instilled in you what you wanted to do for the rest of your life.
Very much so. Yeah. Very much so. I wanted to be a historian. I wanted to be a teacher and a writer. And history was the way to go about doing that. American history. And so that's what I did. I started off as a Civil War historian, but I branched in other directions over the years. So now I'm an American historian.
Do you find that some teachers don't realize how influential that they can be on one individual like yourself as their teacher?
The good ones, no.
They do.
Oh, sure.
Okay. As you continued on with your education, you obviously changed directions in your writing. At what point and what directions did you go from there? You mentioned the Civil War. You started to branch out then?
Well, and World War II, Dwight Eisenhower called me and asked me to be his biographer, so that got me out of the Civil War and over into World War II. And then he became president, and if I'm going to be writing about him, it's not just the war, and so that got me into the Cold War. And I've done some books on the Cold War and a biography of Eisenhower. And then I got interested in Lewis and Clark. And before that, I had done a book called Crazy Horse and Custer. Custer, of course, was a Civil War figure who kind of fascinated and repelled me, as he does many people. That's George Custer. So I had been doing all that, and then I read the journals of Lewis and Clark and was hooked, and did a book on Lewis and Clark on the expedition. And since then, anything that's in American history, I'm interested in it, and I write about it.
Before we get to Lewis and Clark, I'd like to back up just a little bit with President Eisenhower. You would assume someone in his position that just about anything that you could ever imagine was already public knowledge about somebody like that, but you must have found different things that other people didn't find then.
Well, of course. And that was in some part thanks to Eisenhower himself, who had called me and asked me to come up and see him at Gettysburg, which I did. I was 28 years old. And he wanted me to be an editor of his papers. And he said to me at the end, I spent 5 days with him, and at the end of the time, he asked me, did I have any questions left? And I said, well, of course I do, all kinds. But most of all, I'd like to know, why me? How did you happen to pick me? And he said, I had read your book on Henry Halleck, and I thought, that's the man that I want. So that got me going on Eisenhower, where I spent the next 15 years, I suppose, working on Eisenhower. And then my publisher said, you got to do Nixon next. And I said, I don't even like the guy. I'm not going to do Dick Nixon. And the publisher hooked me with this line, where else are you going to find a greater challenge? So that was 10 years of my life I spent with Dick Nixon, 3 volumes worth. And finished that, and then I got back into World War II, and then back into Lewis and Clark, and so on.
Is it frustrating to spend that much time on one topic?
Oh, no, it was fascinating. I never did learn to like Nixon, but I came to admire him. When he was an active politician and I was a citizen, I never voted for him and wouldn't have, and I'm glad that I didn't. But I came to have a deep admiration for the man. And it fit anyway, because he didn't want to be liked. He wanted to be admired. And I did, learn to admire him. I also learned in the process of doing that, the Republicans aren't all that bad. There are some, and Eisenhower obviously not, but that there are members of the Republican Party that I came to become friends with and looked up to and regard with a great deal of approval.
Tremendous.
That was a big surprise to me.
Excuse me. There's an intense interest, and rightfully so, in Lewis and Clark. How much different was it to try and research that compared to somebody like Nixon, who was still very current?
Well, the first difference is there was nobody alive. And all my World War II books are based on interviews. And with Eisenhower, I had a letter from Eisenhower to give this young man anything that he wants, including interviews. And so I got to interview all the big shots that were in the Eisenhower administration and had been with Ike during the war. And with Nixon, the same thing. I got to interview Ehrlichman and Haldeman and Kissinger and all the characters who were a part of the Nixon administration. There was nobody alive from Lewis and Clark. There were no interviews to do. But there's a lot of writing on Lewis and Clark, and of course I used all of it, and it helped considerably But most of all, it's the journals of Lewis and Clark. They are our American epic. Those journals, our poem. And they're just, there's 7 volumes in the Thwaites edition. And it's just fascinating. I couldn't stop reading them. And then I couldn't stop visiting the sites. Now, I've been out west quite a bit doing Crazy Horse and Custer, but Lewis was different. I would come out to Montana and Idaho and Oregon and Washington every summer, for the whole summer. I needed an opportunity to make it a tax-deductible trip. Because I was a professor. I wasn't making a hell of a lot of money. I mean, I used to have to wonder if I could afford to take my wife out to dinner on Saturday night or not. But I would take all of our kids, 5 of them, and the dog, and follow Lewis and Clark all summer. And I had to be able to tax deduct that. That was going to help some. And I had to be able to tell the tax judge, if I ever got called up, Your Honor, I'm writing a book. It takes a long time to write a book. And when I get the book finished and it starts to bring in some royalties, I'll be paying taxes on those royalties. Well, I never had to do that. They never did call me in. But I got to say, the federal government got an awful lot more money out of my taxes on royalties than I ever was able to deduct from traveling out west in a Volkswagen bus with the kids and the dog and camping all the time. So it wasn't a very big tax deduction.
I know you work directly with your son, Hugh, but what about the other family members? Are they just as awestruck with Lewis and Clark because of that travel?
Oh, very much so. We would sit around the campfire every night, and I would pull out the journals, and I would read Lewis's entry and Clark's entry for that day, usually sitting at a campfire where they sat and wrote these entries. And I would read them aloud to the kids, and then we would go off on this or that part of the trail, depending on where the campsite was, and they and my wife all became very fascinated. Now my oldest daughter, Stephanie, is doing an encyclopedia of Lewis and Clark. Hugh is my partner, my chief researcher, and I couldn't get along without Hugh. Andy is working with a travel agency in New Orleans that does Lewis and Clark tours. Grace is a photographer, among other things, and she takes an awful lot of Lewis and Clark pictures.
So because of
And
that...
then my son Barry has done some research for me, but he got hooked so deeply. He was born 150 years too late. He would have been a great mountain man. He's the best fisherman I know. And he used to hunt with rifles. And then with the Lewis and Clark example, I'm doing black powder. So it was black powder for a long time, and now it's nothing but bow and arrow. And I'm very proud to say he got 3 elk in the last 3 years with his bow and arrow. The last one, a 13-point buck.
The book Undaunted Courage, I know inspired a lot of people to follow Lewis and Clark a lot more. What role do you think that is playing in the big anniversary that's coming up, your book?
And that's for other people to judge. I do get people saying to me, "You're the one that made this interest in Lewis." I didn't. I'm just a writer. That's all I do. It was Lewis and Clark that did the expedition, and that's what people want to go out and see, and where they were, and the gates of the mountains, or Lemhi Pass, or Three Forks, or whatever. They want to see where Lewis and Clark were. I happen to be very lucky. I came out with my book at just exactly the right time and became the cutting edge of what is now a mountain of Lewis and Clark scholarship that's gone on over the last 4 or 5 years. But now, the Lewis and Clark bicentennial is going to be happening with or without my writing a book. And it was going to be a big deal, whatever. Just as the 100th anniversary in 1904, 05, and 06 was a very big deal in this country. And of course the bicentennial was going to be a big deal. So I get a little irritated when people say, "You're the one that did it." I didn't do it. All I do is write about it.
You were able to, through some inspiration somewhere along the line, turn into a very, very good writer. Was there somebody there that honed that for you?
My students. I would have an 8 o'clock in the morning class. And I get up early, and I've done that all my life. My 8 o'clock class, these kids would come in. This was at the University of New Orleans, an urban school. Most of these kids had jobs, and they were all sleep deprived. And they'd come in at 8 o'clock, and I'd look at their faces, and they would almost dare me to keep them awake. And I quickly learned the way to keep them awake is to tell a story. And don't tell them in advance how it's going to come out, because they don't know. I mean, hell's bells, they don't even know who won World War II at that age. You just tell a story, and do it chronologically. Don't ever leap forward, flash forward as they call it in the writing trade, and don't ever flash back. Just stay right with the chronology, and make certain that the person you're talking about, or the Army of the Potomac, or the Corps of Discovery, or whoever it is that you're talking about, they don't know what's going to happen next. And the kids don't know what's going to happen next. You want to get some tension in your story. You want to make certain that the people are paying attention. I mean, this was also true when I was around the campfires, which I've done an awful lot of. I want those students, or I want the people around the campfire to be leaning forward just a little bit to make sure they don't miss what's going to happen next.
I can see where that would help with the writing.
Yes.
Some of the things that you're working on in the future, I know that you're working directly with Hugh on a new book. When is that going to be on, and what is it about?
I have one coming out in the middle of August called The Wild Blue, which is about the 15th Air Force in Italy flying B-24s over Germany and Austria and Romania and the other Axis powers. And that's coming out very soon. And now I'm working on a book on the war in the Pacific, which means for the first time a lot of Marines, because Marines weren't in the European theater. So I'm working on the Marines, and we'll see how it comes out.
Most of these books, like the book on the Pacific Theater and so forth, seem to take quite a while to do. How long has this been in the research stage, and when do you think it'll actually be published?
We've been interviewing maybe for a year on this, and we'll probably do another year of interview, and then it takes me about a year to write.
Okay.
When I start writing, I'm up at sometimes 4 a.m., and I just can't wait to get... I want to find out what the hell happened next. And I'll write until noon, and have a lunch and a nap and go for a run, and then come back and work for 3-4 hours in the afternoon. And it takes me about a year to write a book.
When you first broke into this business of being a successful writer, how difficult do you think it was?
I didn't break in as a successful writer. I broke in as a writer.
Okay.
The success came
later.
Much later.
Okay. I'm trying to compare when you first got into writing and became successful at it, and the young student who's just getting started today. How different do you think it is? Is it more difficult today to be a successful writer who makes money?
No.
No?
I don't think it's more or less difficult. I think it's just the same. You write good books, people are going to buy them, they're going to read them, and they're going to talk to one another about them, which is by far the best kind of promotion, word of mouth. I'm accustomed to having very good reviews and being on the front page of the New York Times Book Review, and maybe my last 10 books have been in that situation. And reviews are very nice, and I go on the television quite a lot, and I go out and talk to groups and so on. But until The Undaunted Courage came out, I'd be lucky if I sold 20,000, sometimes maybe 30,000. And that would be enough to pay for the research cost, and it was my own interest rather than a desire to get wealthy that got me doing it in the first place. The Undaunted Courage had reviews that I was accustomed to. But the word of mouth on that book, Simon & Schuster initially printed 20,000 copies. And I said to my editor, geez, I think it's going to do a little better than that. And the reply was, we can always reprint. It's now 4 million. And it's not because the reviews are any better than the reviews on Eisenhower or on Nixon or on Crazy Horse and Custer or my other books. It's the word of mouth. It helps a lot when you're doing Lewis and Clark. It starts on the East Coast. It starts at Monticello, and then out of Washington, Tidewater, and goes all the way across the continent to Tidewater in the Pacific. So everybody is involved. And it helps that Lewis wrote so well and Clark wrote so well. And then, of course, the trip itself was just so full of adventures and has that quality that I am most interested in. When Lewis and Clark saw a bend in the river ahead, they didn't know what was going to be in front of them when they made that turn. They didn't know. When they came into the mountains, they had no idea what the Rockies were going to be like. They thought the Rockies would be similar to the Appalachians. And then they got out into Montana and they said, oh my God, just look at that. And then when they got up to Lemhi Pass, they thought they were going to be looking at a slope down, and they could make canoes and get on those canoes and go right on out to the Pacific. And what they saw was the Bitterroot Mountains. And you can't do that through the Bitterroot Mountains. But everything was a surprise to them, and I always wanted it to be a surprise to the reader, as it was a surprise to me in many, many ways.
Professor, we'd like to spend a little bit of time on your concern about the Missouri River.
Yes.
You've mentioned that your family camped along the river and there's a strong interest.
Many times. I just got off the Missouri. I did it last week, and I'm doing it again in September. And I've been on the Missouri, usually in the White Cliffs area, from Fort Benton down to the Judith Landing, every year for 25 years. So it matters to me a lot. It matters to our family a lot. And the thing that is the most gripping to me is everything, it's the first time. Lewis, in the Missouri River Breaks, now declared a national monument, it talked about, today I climbed to the highest bluff. This is out in central, even eastern Montana. I climbed out the canoe and up the bluff, a fatiguing task, but I was well repaid for my labor, because from that spot I saw the Rocky Mountains. He was the first American to ever see the Rocky Mountains. And I've been on that spot with my kids and my wife, and I want to make absolutely sure, and my grandchildren, and I want to make sure that their grandchildren and the grandchildren to follow, and so long as this republic lasts, that every family has an opportunity to go to that spot where Meriwether Lewis first saw the Rocky Mountains. And with the national monument status, it has now been put on the Missouri River Breaks. They will be. And to compare that, you go from St. Louis to Kansas City, and then the river makes that big turn, and you go up past Omaha, and until you get to Niobrara, Nebraska, it's not the river Lewis and Clark came up. It's down to one channel. It's flowing 2 to 3 times as fast. It's all hemmed in by levees. There are no side channels, no islands. All the things that they saw are gone. But once you get into the Dakotas, and even more, once you get into Montana, you're seeing what Lewis and Clark saw. And boy, that matters a lot.
Do you think the way that national parks are designated should be changed, or is it the system working the way it's set up now?
I think the Antiquities Act of 1906, which Theodore Roosevelt was the sponsor of and the president, and he signed it, and then he created more national monuments and parks than any president until Bill Clinton. So at the beginning of the 20th century, at the end of the 20th century, Roosevelt made Grand Canyon into a national park because they had found some coal deposits that are at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, and there were a lot of people wanting to go, let's develop this. And Teddy Roosevelt said, no, you can never improve this, and made it into a national park. The same thing is true of the Missouri River Breaks that Bill Clinton made into a national monument. You can't improve it, and it should never be changed. So I think that that Antiquities Act and the whole National Park Service system are just what we need.
Okay. If it isn't broke, don't fix it.
That's right.
What about the rest of the Missouri River? At one point, did you say that you thought some of the dams should be removed from the Missouri and try and restore it back to its original?
I'd like to see that happen. But listen, I've got family in Montana, and I live in Montana, and I've learned that you don't want to push that in Montana, and I'm not at all. I will make a prediction. I think by the beginning of the next century, the 22nd century, all those dams are going to be gone. And we're going to let the rivers flow the way they did. Fort Peck Dam was built because Frank Roosevelt couldn't think of any other way to put people to work. He had a choice. He was told, listen, let's do what Hitler's doing in Germany, build autobahns, what we now call interstates. And Roosevelt said, oh, Lord, the railroads would kill me if I were to do that, and there'd be so much opposition. Much better. Let's build dams. And he then promised, Fort Peck Dam is awfully big. In fact, from the moon, the astronauts can see only two man-made objects on this Earth. One is the Great Wall of China, and the other is Fort Peck Dam. And they promised, the federal government did, there'll never be another flood. You ask anybody who lived along the Missouri River in 1993 how true that was. And I could go on and on and on, but I'm not advocating, I'm not involved in politics and so on, but I think by the 21st century those dams are going to be gone.
Professor Ambrose, what a wonderful opportunity to sit and talk with you. I know that you're a very busy man. We appreciate having a half hour of time. I know that once you get past your next couple of publications, anything that's really gnawing at you that you want to do?
Yes. I want to devote the rest of my life to the environment. I'm going to switch my focus from what has happened in the past, which is where I've spent my career, to what can be done for the future. I'm a grandfather. I want to make sure that my grandchildren get to see what I've been able to see. And the environment is critical to that. So I'm going to go into environmental work.
Okay. We wish you the very best in all of your endeavors, and thank you again for giving us a half hour of your time to a very, very interesting fellow to talk to, and I know we could go for another 30 minutes.
Thanks for coming by.
Okay.
Much appreciated.
Okay.